65 years and 2 days ago, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that segregation had no place in American schools. Bolling v. Sharp is a historic step towards equality in D.C., and yet the work for equity is in many ways just beginning. Let's roll up our sleeves. Segregation has been at work for far too long. Let's retire segregation today.
Good afternoon. And thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this really interesting, what promises to be a very interesting discussion about this really significant case, Bolling versus Sharp. And I also hope that we can really talk about the historic context, which is really important, which still informs so many of the issues that we're facing in our public schools today. As Jenna noted, May 17th marked the 65th anniversary of the Bolling versus Sharp decision. It was one of the 5 cases consolidated to become the Brown versus Board of Education landmark U.S. Supreme Court case. And Bolling is also noted, challenged school segregation in Washington, D.C. And where we're sitting here today, John Philip Sousa then junior high school, was a school that was at the center of this historic civil rights case. And thanks again for Learn Together, Live Together for hosting this really important discussion today and elevating this issue of school desegregation and equity in the District of Columbia. As Jenna noted, I'm Janel George. I'm Senior Policy Advisor with the Learning Policy Institute. And again, this panel will really give a historical grounding for understanding the significance of the Bolling case. What a lot of people don't recognize is that Brown actually applied to the states. And so the District of Columbia needed its own separate case in order to prohibit school segregation. So that's part of why we're here today. And let's take a moment also to acknowledge the role of parents in furthering desegregation efforts. Are there any parents who are in the audience here today? All right, well let's acknowledge our parents and clap for them. Because we would not be here today, and desegregation would not be a reality were it not for the efforts of parents across this country who had the courage and sacrificed a lot to advance desegregation in our nation's public schools. So here in DC, starting in 1941, a group of parents in Anacostia began to gather to strategize about how to address school desegregation in the district. They were known as the Consolidated Parents Group, and they petitioned the Board of Education of the District of Columbia and its then president, C. Melvin Sharp, to open the John Philip Sousa Junior High School, which was then being completed as a racially integrated school. But their petition was denied. They then sought admission for 11 African American children to the all-white school. But again, their petition was denied. After this denial, they enlisted the help of then Howard University Law School Dean Charles Hamilton Houston, who handed the case over to Howard Law professors James Nabrick and George E.C. Hayes, who filed suit in what would become the Bolling versus Sharp case. And again, the district needed its own case to outlaw school desegregation. And what's also interesting is the Bolling case was actually argued before the Brown versus Board of Education case, but it was decided on the same day. The lead plaintiff of the case was Spotswood Bolling Jr. He was a 12-year-old student, and his mother, Sarah, worked as a bookbinder in the General Services Administration. So, here was this case. It was argued again by James Nabrick Jr. He was a law professor who actually taught the first civil rights course at any law school in the U.S., and he would later become the dean of Howard University Law School and then later president of Howard University. So the case was actually argued in 1952. It had to be re-argued in 1953, and it was successful, along with Brown. outlined and validating school segregation in the District of Columbia. What's interesting is Bolling also had different legal grounds, and I won't get into legal technicalities here, but they argued in the Bolling case that school segregation denied African Americans due process of law as protected by the Fifth Amendment. It lacked an equal protection standard to validate the district's desegregation. But Chief Justice Earl Warren creatively relied on the Fifth Amendment's guarantee of liberty to find the segregation of Washington, D.C.'s public schools unconstitutional. So some very creative litigation strategies there. And let's also recognize here that racially diverse schools are not a panacea. We recognize that. They're not a solution for all of the ills that plague our public schools. However, we also know that the research demonstrating the benefits of learning in racially diverse environments is sound and compelling. We also know that there are well-established programs and strategies for promoting diversity in schools, such as magnet schools and inter-district programs. And these strategies are outlined in the recent Learning Policy Institute report that Janel also referenced, the federal role in school integration, Brown's Promise, and Present Challenges. And that's available at the Learning Policy Institute's website, learningpolicyinstitute.org. And we also recognize that there are other policies, right, like housing policies and others that have profound implications for integration and that actually have the effect of fueling segregation. So this means that there are some families that don't have integrated options. And some families don't want integrated options. They want their children to attend their neighborhood schools. And I think what everyone agrees upon is, as scholar Gary Warfield notes, desegregation was never about Blacks wanting to sit next to whites. It was about equalizing opportunity. And so that's what we focus on and keep in mind here today as we begin our discussion. We have an amazing group of experts who are gathered here today who will discuss the significance of the Bolling case for school desegregation, and also the current state of public school segregation and desegregation efforts here in the districts. So we have Chelsea Coffin, who is director of the Education Policy Initiative at the DC Policy Center, and the recent author of their report, Landscape of Diversity in DC Public Schools, and she'll share the recent research on the state of school desegregation in the district. Chelsea can wave, so I appreciate it. And we have, to her left, Elizabeth Davis, who is president of the Washington Teachers Union and has taught in DC public schools for 42 years, including here at Sousa, and she was instrumental, And she was instrumental in supporting students who organized here to preserve Sousa as a National Historic Landmark, and she will discuss school desegregation in the district from the perspective of an educator. And Kimberly Springle, who is to her left, is director of the Charles Sumner School Museum and Archives, the official museum and repository for DC Public Schools, where she oversees the historic buildings, museums, and its archives. And to my immediate left is Michaele Turnage-Young, who is senior counsel with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. This is a legal firm founded by Thurgood Marshall and others that successfully litigated Brown versus Board of Education. Her current caseload includes desegregation cases, yes, still today, the desegregation cases representing African American children and their parents, as well as support for amicus and post-trial higher education briefs in support of the use of consideration of race in university admissions. So she will discuss LDF's current school desegregation and educational equity work. And to her left is Dawn Williams, who is Dean of the Howard University School of Education, and she has been an educator for over 2 decades. Underlying her work is a belief that social justice can be advanced through research, service, and professional development. and she'll discuss how our university's historic role in changing the educational landscape for African Americans, including its leadership in desegregation efforts and the scholarship produced by its students and alums. So actually, let's start all the way on the end with Ms. Springle. And Ms. Springle, you oversee the historic archives, including some documents related to the Bolling case. What can you share with us about this case from a historian's perspective?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I think from a historian's perspective, what I want to say is you have to wind the clock backwards a little bit. And just to give you a little bit of overview about the Charles Sumner School Museum and Archives, it is housed in a historic African-American school building dated 1872. So again, to give a little context, last month we celebrated DC Emancipation Day. April 16th, 1862 was when slavery was abolished in the District of Columbia. So again, at that point, immediately following, for the first time, there were public accommodations, schools, and a congressional mandate that public education be provided for African American students. So to provide you a little bit of context there, and to go back further, public schools started in 1804 in Washington, D.C. So again, the Bolling v. Sharp case, of course, came about with the Brown decision in 1954. But I want to share just a few other examples of citizens fighting for equity within the school system even prior to that. There is a case, has anyone heard of Carla Galarza before, anyone in the audience? So she was a white student who was fighting to stay at M.M. Washington School, which was a vocational school for women. And she came from Sacramento, California, and her stepfather was Mexican American, so there's been some confusion about her ethnicity, but she was a white student who wanted to attend M.M. Washington and not Burdick, which was the school for white students, specifically because there was a fashion design and dressmaking program at that school. So that's one incident. Another incident is Central High School for Cardozo. That's a white school that closed in 1950 to accommodate students from Cardozo High School because there was severe overcrowding in the African American schools, which also leads up to this Bolling case. And the third example I want to share is 1952, when Spingarn High School was the last segregated public school to be built in Washington, D.C. There was no high school on this side of town in Northeast at that time, and there had not been a public high school built for Black children since, I think it was 35 years prior. So again, there was a lot happening at this time period that leads up to the Bolling v. Sharp case. As Janel has pointed out, it was really a grassroots effort by parents. And that's very significant from a historic perspective to really, yes, it became part of the NAACP profile in the Brown v. Board of Education case, but it's very important to note that the parents were fed up with their students having to attend school in shifts and not the full school day. So it's immediately issues with equity. So to wind the clock back even further with Sumner as an example, it's a living example. It's a phenomenal building. If you have not been, 1872 school building, but a couple of blocks away is the Franklin School building, which is designed by the same architect 1 year prior for white students. Is larger than the Sumner School. It has nicer interiors than the Sumner School, the original. There's original marble in Franklin. Sumner has marble now, but that happened later in the 80s. So again, I just want people to consider that Bolling v. Sharp does not exist in a vacuum devoid of these other factors. And as a historian, we like to speak about timelines and things of that nature, but our lateral histories, but there are other things that happened prior and that contributed to the Bolling case that wrapped up in '54.
Thank you so much for that context. So I'll turn to my left, Ms. Young. As much as we would like to believe that segregation is a thing of the past, 65 years after the Brown and Bolling rulings, the reality we know is that de facto segregation is still very real. It manifests in many ways. Can you talk a little bit about some of your current work at LDF and some of the ways that you all are seeing de facto segregation being perpetuated? So what are some of the strategies that you all are looking at to help eliminate it?
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me here. I'm honored to be a part of a celebration of this momentous case. This case really did, it was the first step in the country beginning to fulfill its loftiest ideals when it comes to really living up to that ideal that everyone's created equal and everyone's going to be able to take advantage of equal opportunities. So I have to say, I've been doing school desegregation work for several years now, and there are times when I meet people and they might ask, what do you do for a living? And, I'll tell them, I'm a lawyer, I prosecute school desegregation cases in different parts of the country. And people stop and say, what? Wait, what do you do? And people are in disbelief that school desegregation cases are still going on. They absolutely are still going on. There are a number of open cases around the country. So it's exciting to be able to tell you a little bit about that work. So school desegregation cases are all about equal educational opportunities. In our school desegregation work, it's not just about making sure that students are able to go to school with other students regardless of race. It's also about so many other things. It's really making sure that people have equal opportunities in every facet of school operations. So what that means is that we're looking to make sure that faculty are assigned in an equitable manner. We want to make sure that teachers and educators are assigned to schools without regard to their race. We want to make sure that teachers and educators each school has access to credentialed teachers, that each school has access to teachers who are actually in attendance. The research shows that students are harmed by teachers who are missing 10 days or more of school. So we want to make sure that all the teachers who tend to miss school aren't concentrated in one school. We also want to make sure that students have access to teachers who are teaching in their area of expertise, that students have equitable access to experienced teachers. We're also concerned about the staff. We want to make sure that students have the opportunity to interact with staff members in their school without regard to race. We don't want it to be the situation that all of the white cafeteria workers are assigned to one school, and we don't want the situation to be that there are schools where the students have never seen a white janitor, or, if in fact there are white janitors somewhere in that district, they need to be equitably allocated. School desegregation cases are also concerned with making sure that students have equal opportunities when it comes to extracurricular activities. So the research tells us that there are a large number of benefits that students get from participation in sports and, arts and different types of activities. But, the nationwide trend is that Black and Latinx students don't have equal access to these opportunities. And so in these cases, we want to make sure that, if football is something that's offered at one school, we want to see it offered everywhere. We want to make sure that all of the schools have equal access to all of the, the range of different sports and activities, and that there aren't barriers preventing students from actually being able to take part. We don't want to see a situation where students have to obtain a teacher recommendation, or they have to be, sparkly clean in terms of disciplinary record, and that's having a racially disparate impact on which students are actually participating. School desegregation cases are also about making sure that students have comparable facilities. There are times when we go to a school district and one school within the school district is amazing. It looks like a model home. And then we drive down the street and there's another school that was built 50, 60 years ago. It's been extremely poorly maintained. There's holes in the ceiling. It's leaking. There's black mold. That's not what we want to see. That sort of then communicates very clearly a message to the children who is valued and who is not. Other than that, there's a safety issue. We want our students to be able to focus on learning. We certainly do not want our students to be so cold because the heater hasn't been working in years that they can't focus on learning trigonometry. Similarly, we don't want our students to be so hot in the summer that they're, passing out. That's not okay. School desegregation cases also focus on equity in transportation. It's very important that students not have to travel farther or not have to travel on less well-maintained school buses because they happen to be a certain race. So when we enter a school district and we notice that for whatever reason the school district has allocated more resources to maintaining and purchasing more buses for its fleet in only a certain neighborhood and the other neighborhoods have just done without, and now these children are having to travel 2 or 3 times as far as the other children to get to school, that's not okay. We'll talk to them about how, the research shows that long commutes to school are not positively correlated with academic achievement. And, how can we support you in equalizing that situation? School desegregation cases also focus on quality of education. So we're talking about making sure that the administration of discipline is done in a fair manner. We certainly don't want to see that educators are moving children from the classroom for nonviolent offenses, and they're doing it at such a rate where the lost instruction is so different as between different groups. We don't want to see a situation where Black students are losing the opportunity to even be in their classrooms at 3, 4, 5, 6, 20 times the rate of their white classmates. And it's causing educational deficit. And so we'll work with schools on how can we support you in classroom management so that you can do this in a way where you're not having a racially disparate impact. We also look at graduation rates. We look at the rate at which children are being held back a grade. It's everything. It's really not just about whether Black students have the opportunity to sit next to their white classmates in school. It's about all of these things. And I will tell you, so there is kind of a neo-Plessyism going on. Plessy was the case that said, separate but equal. Now, there are people out there who kind of say, why is it so important to have diverse schools? Why is separate but equal not enough? Well, the research shows us that separate is usually not equal, so there's that. But the other thing that's very important, especially for us parents, is that we all want our children to do well. We all want our children to be adequately prepared to succeed in the global economy and the global workforce. And the research tells us that interacting with somebody who is different from yourself actually improves your critical thinking skills, your communication skills, your civic involvement, your long-term health outcomes, your long-term career outcomes. There's just this laundry list. And essentially what's happening is this. If you go into a classroom and say you have a speech debate and everyone in that classroom is coming from the same background as you, you might walk into the classroom assuming that those people hold the same premises that you do. You're not necessarily going to prepare to advance your argument as well as you might if you walk into the classroom knowing that everyone is coming from different experiences. People aren't necessarily going to share the premises, that underlie your argument. And so you're going to prepare that much more. A lifetime of working in racially diverse classroom environments is going to foster much stronger critical thinking skills, much stronger communication skills, a much better ability to just go and navigate well in a global workplace in the future.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And it's fitting that we transition to Ms. Davis, who's a DC educator and social justice advocate. We also can't overlook the role or understate the role, significance of the roles of Black educators in advancing desegregation efforts. They often work with groups like LDF to also identify plaintiffs and plaintiff families. So Ms. Davis, as a DC educator and social justice advocate, what are some of the ways that you have witnessed the perpetuation of racial segregation in the district's public schools? And as an educator, what are effective strategies for working with students to help address it?
Thank you. And I was sitting and reflecting on why I chose to stay in the classroom for 44 years. I do know my first year started at Jefferson Junior High School as a female teacher asked to teach drafting. I was an engineering student. The professor who encouraged me to do so was Carl Hansen, who was one of the, if not, I think he was the superintendent of DC Public Schools at the time. He had just stepped down, and a lawsuit was filed against him in the Hobson versus Hansen case. So Carl Hansen was my professor who suggested that I teach drafting in a public school as an experiment. And of course, I was the first female to do so. Did not know that when I arrived at Jefferson. So the principal approached me told me that I needed to report back to HR because there was no such thing as a female teaching drafting. And of course, I was hurt. I was only 19, so I'm very young. And HR informed me that I had the right to stay there, and I knew that. So they returned me after I filed a sex discrimination complaint the very next day. And I began my career as a teacher at Jefferson. I had to do the same thing at the middle for the second semester. When the girls in my 9th grade class who thought that they were going to be allowed to take their drawings from my class into a woodworking class in the second semester and were denied access because girls were not allowed to take the non-traditional courses at that time. So I filed a complaint on behalf of the female students and won that, so those classes opened up to girls. That basically set the stage for the type of teacher I chose to be from that point forward. But it also raised my passion for teaching because I began to realize that my classroom was more than just a place for me to teach the 3 R's, but also to teach students how to advocate for themselves and give me an opportunity to sort of live out my life as somewhat of a student activist. A classroom that became more of a social justice laboratory than anything else. I enjoyed it. I realized that my lived experience as a child after moving to Washington, D.C. in the 3rd grade from a segregated school system, because of a segregated school system there, I learned and remembered a lot of things about that experience. So when I landed into this career as a teacher at Jefferson, moving through the system from school to school, one of the schools was Sousa. When I learned about the Bolling case, it was a brief article in the Washington Post one day, and I shared it with some of my 6th graders up the hallway there. They didn't seem as excited as I was, mainly because they did not know the history, nor did they care about it. And one young lady actually told me that she was not as excited about that history as I was. And later they did, because each year these students had to design a school of the future. And embedded in my curriculum, which I designed myself, not only for my school, but for the entire school district, I embedded ways for teachers to connect what they were teaching to real-world problem solving. We had a lot of problems at Sousa. This was in 2005. The school was run down in deplorable condition. The library had been closed for 3 years. There was no school librarian. And of course, when the students read about the Bolling case, they informed me that there was nothing different about the school then, that we were still in a segregated school system, and that the condition of the building was the same as it had been for Black children back in 1953. So there were a lot of lessons for me to teach students at that time, but I did not want them to go into the story for the sake of remembering the dates. I wanted them to go into this story to find out how could they use the history of the Bolling and Brown case to solve the problems in their own school and in their community. And as a result of studying the case, I had to sit down and literally write the case into a story, personal narrative, for the students to read. They loved it. At the end of the school year, they won their School of the Future design competition, but more importantly, they had, as an audience, they captured the attention of Congresswoman Norton, who invited them to the Congressional Black Caucus's Forum on Brown. And from there, Ted Kennedy and Nancy Pelosi to the Senate's commemoration of Brown. And I didn't want them to attend those events for the sake of regurgitating dates and facts about the Bolling case. I wanted them to use what they knew about the Bolling and Brown and Plessy case to make the case for changing the inequities that still existed in their school and in DC. So as an educator, for me, from day one, and I have actually taught in 9 schools here in the district, but in each of those schools, even to this very moment, the work that I did then is the work I do now as president of the union. Equity is at the center of everything I did, every lesson. And in each case, if I was unable to connect that lesson to the lives of my students, I was not as interested. And if it was not connected, I would figure out a way to do that. Helping teachers to do the same. Showing them that the most powerful allies that they could possibly have are the parents. Being willing to have courageous conversations about inequities that exist not only in the city and in their schools, but also in their classrooms. So as a leader of this union, having an opportunity to engage with individuals throughout the US who talk about equity, how do we do more than just talk about it? Because my favorite mantra became in each school, when students complained about a problem in the classroom, in the school, or in their community, my question was, what are you going to do about it? And using history as a roadmap for helping you to figure out what to do. So educators at this time in DC, we have the diversity of the teaching force has declined. Teachers of color since 2007 has dropped from 79% to 49%. And the diversity of the teaching force is important not only because Black students need to see Black teachers or brown students. All students need to see teachers of color at the head of their classrooms, white, brown, and others. Before President Obama stepped out, there was actually a national interest, focus on the decline in the teaching force. Teachers of color in DC has declined in so many ways, but it has also affected expectations, how students are perceived. Teachers that are recruited from all over the US who come with their own perceptions about students, but need to understand how those perceptions sometimes will shape their level of expectation for those children. So there are a lot of lessons that we can take from the Bolling case. And when I think about how the students navigated through that case, it took them to Plessy v. Ferguson. It took them to the other 4 corresponding cases involved in Brown. And in each case, it took them to Kenneth Clark's experiment with the black dolls that was conducted 3 years ago to get the very same results. The very same results. So it leads us to Chief Justice Earl Warren's decision as to why he decided to overturn Plessy. And I think in one of the most compelling statements he made was the damaging effects of separation had on Black children, effects that we could not see visibly, but the harm that was done to children as a result of being in unequal circumstances. We still have that situation here, and we are still using this case, hopefully, to discover how do we undo a lot of what has been done. De facto segregation is as alive as it was 65 years ago. Gentrification in DC is basically at an all-time high. And so as a part of what educators do, it's also about educating each other, about how do we look at how policy decisions are made in this city that actually fuel and facilitate some of the things that lead to the inequities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Davis. Ms. Coffin, given the changing landscape of the district, you actually looked at this in a recent report by the DC Policy Center, Landscape of Diversity in DC Public Schools. Can you talk a little bit about that changing landscape and what are some of the promising policies and practices for promoting school diversity within the district? And also really addressing the issue that I think a couple of the panelists raised, which is ensuring that within the classroom, students feel valued and included.
Thanks, and I'm so honored to be here today with Elsie, and everyone on the panel and in the audience to commemorate this anniversary I'm also happy to be sharing data after we've had some other engaging presenters. So just to set the stage with the findings from our report with some background on students in DC's traditional public and public charter schools. In the last year, 67% of students were African American, 19% were Latino, 10% were white, and 4% were of other races and ethnicities. So this does limit the degree of diversity that you can have at each school. However, and also the school age population is slightly different demographically than those who choose to enroll in DC's public schools. The school age population is about 10% percentage points more white. So we are seeing that opportunity to have diverse schools, given the mix of students in DC, is narrowed. So in our report, we looked at both the state of racial and ethnic diversity and also economic diversity, just to get a sense of how those go hand in hand in DC and how they're linked to the city's geography. And we had three main findings. The first, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is that many schools have extremely high concentrations of students from one race or ethnicity. And in fact, over half of our schools have a student body that's over 90% or more African American students, including Susan Middles. So, and then when we turn to look at economic segregation, we did this using any policy once in the audience, the at-risk measure, which is driven off by students who are on TANF and SNAP. But schools are more mixed economically. We have about half of our schools have between 40 and 60% of students who are at risk. So that means that students may have an opportunity within a school to interact more with students who are from a different socioeconomic group than a different race or ethnicity. That's important to consider. And our second finding in DC was geographically, we did see most of the racial and ethnic diversity west of Rock Creek Park. And we saw economic diversity more east of the river. So we're kind of seeing these patterns that do reinforce some the segregated housing that we do see in the district. Although in DC, as I'm sure many of you are aware, only 25% of students attend the right to attend school. So we have the potential for students to attend more diverse schools and break out of their segregated neighborhoods. And our third finding was that the two types of diversity didn't generally go hand in hand. We saw that schools were usually racially and ethnically diverse or economically diverse, and only 8 schools were at the top of the list in both of those categories. Most of the schools, for those of you very familiar with the district, were in wards 1 and 4, and all of them but one were elementary or middle. So that's kind of where we're seeing the most diversity happen in the city. And some others have talked about changing demographics in the city. Over the last 5 years, the student body has shifted, and it's become less African American, about 8 percentage points, and more Latino by about 5 percentage points, and more white by about 2 percentage points. So that's kind of does allow, given our definition of diversity, which was the size of the largest student group at a school, it does allow for more diversity, but we're not seeing diversity at the school level change in lockstep with how it's changing at the system level. The score didn't change in kind of to the same degree as the potential. So that's the bad news. But I think the practices that can really bring, once you do start to have more desegregated schools, and you really need to focus on what happens inside the classroom and inside of schools, as many of you know, especially the educators in the audience. And there are some promising practices within the district. Kindred is one organization that works to bring parents together and create authentic relationships. And there are several schools in DC that do have diversity as seek diversity purposefully as part of their mission. So.
Thank you so much. And Dean Williams. So we know that Charles Hamilton Houston and other prominent people, civil rights leaders from Howard University, have really had a tremendous impact on desegregation efforts. What is the significance of Howard University's role in school desegregation overall, and also its role in educating, supporting, and mentoring Black leaders who have been so influential in desegregation and other civil rights efforts.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for the invitation from LTLT to be here to have this conversation with you all today. I'm here to speak a little bit more about Howard University and the influence that we have had, particularly in the city, but then nationwide as it relates to desegregation efforts. I'm going to start with a case that is probably closer to me and my familial roots, and then talk a little bit about the DC case. So as you know, Brown is made up of 4 and plus the 5, the Bolling case. The one that I want to bring to your attention that really has a connection to Howard University as well is in Prince Edward County, Virginia. So some of you may be aware of that one. That particular case within Brown was the one where students led the charge. I think about 115 or 117 high school students who in 1951 had a strike. Because of deplorable conditions within their school. It was a case also taken up by the NAACP, and it was a case that was consolidated to the larger Brown case that was decided in 1954. But what happened after that case is probably a less known story. So in 1954, Brown was decided. In 1955, Brown 2 was decided. That meant we needed to segregate schools with all deliberate speed. And that was interpreted differently in different local contexts. How it was interpreted in Prince Edward County, Virginia, was that we are not going to have schools, a public school system, if Black and white children have to be educated together. So the decision that the county school board made was to close the schools in 1959. They closed all public schools, which meant the public school for the white students, as well as the public school for the Black students. Those schools remained closed until 1964. So that was a 5-year closing. That is probably the largest case of massive resistance to desegregation that a lot of people don't know about. NAACP was very connected to this case and was very instrumental with having the schools be open again in 1964. There was a lawyer who took up the case during that time. His name was Oliver Hill Sr. And he was a graduate of Howard. So I wanted to start with that story, number one, because my father was a part of the school closings in Prince Edward County, Virginia. He and his brothers, my uncles, and my aunt didn't get to finish high school because the schools closed for 5 years and they migrated north. So I'm from New York City, and my familiar roots went to New York in search of more possibilities because there wasn't education possibilities in Virginia, a very rural town within the central part of Virginia. So even that one case that really elevated to the Supreme Court, there was still a Howard person connected to it. Howard was founded in 1867. Civil rights is a part of our institutional DNA. It can be found within the law school, which I'll talk a little bit more about today, but it's found in really all of our 13 schools and colleges. I'm here representing the School of Education. There are a number of things that we do as well in more contemporary terms to help the fight for equal justice within schools and particularly as it relates to educator preparation. Now, going back to the Bolling case. So Charles Hamilton Houston was the one who began working on that case. He became ill and passed the case down to James Nabritt. James Nabritt, as was mentioned during the introduction, taught the first civil rights law case in any American law school. That's extreme. To know that the first civil rights law case was taught at Howard University. He then advanced on to become the dean of the law school as well as the president of the university, the second Black president of Howard University. The other connections related to the Brown case, which has already been mentioned, with Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who were psychologists and also alum of Howard. So you should know that this work was interdisciplinary. The dean of the law school at the time, the dean of the School of Education, Charles Thompson, helped the lawyers in the law school to draft these the narratives that will be a part of the testimony when arguing this case. So the history of Howard University around justice is one that is a part of our founding, it's a part, again, of our institutional DNA. But when I talk about it in more contemporary terms, there is an education rights center that we have at the Howard University Law School, as well as the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center. These are our advocacy arms. These centers also file amicus briefs within the Supreme Court and remain active with the local community.
Thank you so much for that rich context. Please join me in thanking our panelists today. We'll take a few minutes for questions, and then we'll hear just some closing remarks from our panelists.
Thanks so much for your comments. I found the comments from Ms. Young really enlightening. And I'm wondering if in your overview or your understanding about DC public schools, if you see an opportunity to pursue any legal action based on inequitable facilities or the inequitable distribution of resources across the city from an operations perspective or a resource perspective. And I understand that you may not be deeply familiar with the landscape, but with your whatever understanding that you have.
Thank you so much for that question. I think there's always an opportunity to take a critical look at whatever inequities exist within a school district and think about how we can improve. It might not necessarily be through litigation. It could be, it might not necessarily be, but I think the important thing for us to know as a community is that we can always, there's so much publicly available information out there that will allow you to assess, is a school district serving its students in an equal manner? And if they aren't, it is incumbent upon us as community members to educate ourselves about what those inequities are and think about what we can do to support the school district in doing a better job of serving all of its students equally. And so if it's a matter of, well, one facility is more well-maintained or got a resource than another facility, then, talk to your neighbors, talk to your community members, and, go and approach the school district and try to push them to do better. And if they're not willing to ask, then, just take it from there and figure out what it is you can do. I think the very first step is educating yourselves and building community awareness so that you can effectively push for change. And absolutely think about, is there a way to go about using litigation? But litigation is one tool. We also very much encourage community, educating themselves, engaging in grassroots organizing, and just, operating through whatever tools you can to try and get that change done.
Hi, thank you so much to all of you. And this is for anybody who wants to answer it. So in DC, as we all know, we have school choice as a lever for creating more equity and opportunity. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on, as it is right now, is that, in your opinion, enough? If not, what direction should we go in now?
I'm going to briefly chime in on this one. So long ago, when these cases were first getting started, one of the first ways that people decided to approach desegregating our public schools was through something called freedom of choice. What that meant is that instead of assigning an individual student to a school, the school district said to everyone, you can pick whatever school you want to. And expected private citizens to do the work of desegregating the schools. Now, later court cases came about and said, to the extent that freedom of choice is not effective, the school districts need to try something different. And, courts later came and said, given the context of things, we have a lot of racism, we have a lot of racial terrorism going on, where, literally we're talking about the FBI had to be sent into communities to investigate incidents of racial terrorism that were happening because people chose to opt to send their children to formerly de jure segregated schools. So within that context, courts identified that maybe this freedom of choice thing isn't working so well. So over the years, we have had courts kind of saying, you know, voluntary initiatives are great if they work, but if they don't work, you might want to think about some other things. And we're still in this place where we do have a number of choice initiatives that sometimes can be brilliant and wonderful and great, but in some communities, they're not yielding a lot of results. And so in those communities, the onus is upon the community members to really think about what can we do to move the ball forward if voluntary efforts aren't working.
And I think that is an example of some of those unintended consequences of an effort that was put forth to do something different. Here in DC, we have about 66 or 67 LEAs, also known as local education associations, which one LEA could be a mom and pop charter school, and another LEA could be a charter school that has several campuses under their branch. And the onus is on the parents at the beginning to do the research to see if this is the best school for your child if you don't deem that your neighborhood school is one. So in a sense, we have two different school districts operating in DC. And it's pretty extreme in this area compared to other districts. The number of educational opportunities that are different than the local public schools. All the cases that we talked about within the Brown started with the community. LTLT is a function of the community. If you desire to attend your neighborhood school and you think that your neighborhood school is not meeting the needs, not just of your child, but the children in the community, then you must speak up. The resources that Howard University, as an example that I talked about, or either the LDF of NAACP have supplied, really started with your voice as the community, coming to us as a resource within the community that can help to move the change that you desire. This time is no different. As a matter of fact, this time is probably more pertinent than ever. When we use the word equity a lot, but please note that equity also represents threat to some people when that term is used, because equity might mean giving more over here, giving less over here. Equity and equal are not the same. So equity, sometimes some people may feel like, what's going to happen if we go about an equitable dissemination of resources? What's going to happen to my household as a result? So even though we use that word an awful lot, please understand the perspectives of others that word might mean something very different for them that they're not talking about.
Yeah, and I would just add that school choice does allow for schools to pursue diversity as part of their mission and have unique goals, and it also allows for citywide schools. So I think those that allows, given the right transportation and opportunities, it does allow for more integration than we have in our neighborhoods. I think for this for school choice to really be realized segregation in DC, we need demand from students and caregivers and families for both racial and ethnic diversity, but also economic diversity within the same schools, given the existing demographics. And we're kind of seeing now in DC that generally the schools are kind of okay with one or the other. Families tend to attend schools that are diverse in one way or the other. That's the next step.
And I guess my historical memory about segregated schools caused me to wonder if choice is really about providing access to all students, or is it a way of furthering segregation? I perceive school choice at the beginning stages as privatization, a move to basically privatize public education. To some extent, I still believe that. I do remember 20 plus years ago when school vouchers were introduced in DC, there was a concerted effort to stop that as actually another stage of privatizing public schools. So what I'm learning from parents as I meet with different PTA groups, PTSOs, and teachers in each ward is that the preference seems to be for a quality matter of right public school system. And of course, although we have charters proliferating heaviest in certain parts of the city, namely in Ward 7 and 8, the preference by most parents, including in those wards, is to have healthy feeder patterns of public schools in every ward. So the choice for, as far as I'm concerned, and of course, charter schools are here to stay. Some of the same inequities that exist in public schools exist in charter schools. And one of the things that concern me most is that charter schools may encourage greater segregation as opposed to integration. And parents would like to see in every ward of the city, irrespective of race, children being able to attend their own neighborhood public schools. And of course, our public school systems, we cannot acknowledge that they are what we want them to be, but we do want to preserve a public school system mainly because they are required to educate all children.
Another question over here.
This is from Ms. Davis. Ms. Davis, I feel like I wouldn't represent this ward if I didn't ask you to elaborate on the school somehow. They sacrificed for the school because of Brown versus Board of Education. It gave this neighborhood the strength, and you was part of it. So I think I would be not doing a service to this community if you did say how they sacrifice and the children sacrifice for this school.
Thank you. And I had a difficult time finding out where you were. And of course, I mentioned earlier that project that students, I did not want to go into a long description of that. I did bring a copy of the article that someone asked me to write about the students at SUSA who actually preserved this school's designation as a historic landmark. I saw it as an opportunity to teach a lesson about the case, but also to use the history of the Bolling case, the Brown case, the Plessy case, to help students understand that they can become the change that they wanted to see in their school and in their neighborhoods. I still believe that. The work was actually done by students. The most exciting part of it was having parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles who came to the school to sit in classes to hear about the story, but to also share their connections to the story. You do recall Mr. William Wilson, who attended school with Spotswood Bolling. And of course, Spotswood Bolling's wife came here and sat on the stage with students on the 50th anniversary of the Bolling and Brown case. It was an exciting 7 years spent here at SUSA. And of course, the most exciting part of it was students taking what they learned and using it to change their own lives. Thank you for bringing that up.
Another question?
Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Tatiana Robinson, and I serve as the student representative on the DC State Board of Education. And I just jotted down my question so I wouldn't forget it. As a student leader, I want to ensure that our peers have more access to the information that is being discussed today. So while I do understand that DCPS and DC Public Charter Schools are teaching based on the Common Core standards, how are your local organizations that are being represented here on this panel today equipping teachers to ensure this much needed equity conversation is happening in DCPS classrooms? And not just within the DCPS cornerstones, but because they're just basically discussing a tiny fraction of this information. So besides the cornerstones, how do we ensure that this conversation is happening in DCPS classrooms?
Thank you for that question. This is, I guess, a good opportunity again to share about the DC Public School Museum and Archives. Charles Sumner School Museum and Archives is a resource, and if there are any educators in this building right now that has not been, please see me and I can share more details about how to connect with the site. But DC is ahead as having this site. It's been around for now only almost 35 years. We have all of the Board of Education meeting minutes dating back to 1804, class pictures, building pictures, vertical files in all the schools, literally a comprehensive history, primary documents in which students can engage with to do empowering things like what Dr. Davis led here at SUSA. This is using history to make change in the flesh. We're sitting in the building now because of the work that she did. So we always are looking for opportunities for educators and students to engage with the content. We've worked with students as young as 4th grade to go back and fetch the history related to their schools and create exhibitions and really use that history to inform who they are today, identity, and also just using the past in the present sense as well. So I want to encourage everyone to visit the Sumner Museum, support the archives. We have incredible resources there, and you really have to come and check it out to see it. But it's there at your fingertips, and that's for educators, citizens. We have all sorts of stakeholders who use that content in the present.
Thank you for that honorary doctorate degree, which I have not earned. Tatiana, thank you for that question. The WTU began a task force 3 years ago, an equity task force. At this time, there are about 29 teachers. The person that advised these teachers on what type of professional development we need to offer our members is Enid Lee. She's an anti-racist educator from California. I met her in the writing project in 1995 with 2 ladies that are the director of the writing project, Ms. Judith Kelly, who's sitting here, and Pearline Umbles, who was also a member. Those teachers basically, Ms. Lee comes into DC 3 times a year to meet with these teachers on how to, number one, have conversations with colleagues in their own schools, but first to use an anti-racist lens to look at how they teach, expectations they have for students based on race and class, and teachers who attend the sessions are teachers from all ethnic and racial backgrounds. And we want to basically, the next step is to have a conversation with Chancellor Furby to express the need for us to provide that type of training and professional learning sustained for all teachers in our schools. So thank you for raising that, because that is one of our initiatives, and we certainly look forward to hearing more from you and from students as to what other issues we need to explore.
I think that's a phenomenal question, and I applaud you for raising it. One thing I want to speak to about related to educator preparation, because at Howard University School of Education, what we do is prepare professionals to work within schools, teachers, counselors, psychologists, but also administrators. And this is sort of a struggle for us. Time is always a struggle as well. So while we are preparing educators to work with and implement Common Core, we're also preparing them to do it in a culturally relevant way. But not just in a culturally relevant way, we use the term culturally affirming. So I know for teachers that can be a difficult thing to do because of time, but there are skillful ways that it can be incorporated to ensure that both needs are getting met, that students are prepared for those standardized exams, but then they're also prepared to know more about themselves and the contributions that their people have brought to our democracy. So noting that is an important element for thriving as an individual. And I'm glad that you referenced the writing project. It's a writing project that happens at Howard University, where we do work with teachers to help with that particular skill. Another example that I give, one of our current faculty members who's our science educator. So although she's teaching these scientific concepts around geology, et cetera, all the different concepts, she is also talking about the contributions that African Americans or the individuals from the African diaspora have lent to these formations, to this knowledge that we are learning about. So again, not just culturally relevant, but culturally affirming. And it's a skill to be able to achieve both goals of having students understand the concept, but then also having them feel good about themselves and what they bring to the larger society.
Thank you so much for your question. One of the things that is important should be important to all of us as parents is, a part of making sure that our children are prepared to lead and succeed in a global workplace is making sure that they know about their own heritage, but also know about the cultures and heritage of others. Education should function as both a mirror, so you see yourself, and also a window, so that you can see into the experiences of other communities, especially people that you are going to encounter later on in life when you're in the workplace. And so one of the things that we do in our school desegregation work is assess whether the school districts are providing culturally responsive teaching, meaning that, you know, education is both a mirror and a window. And, you know, do those schools, are they equipped with a set of books that, you know, isn't just written by, you know, from one experience? We want to make sure that there are books written by authors from all walks of life. We want to make sure that those books, those texts, those materials are integrated into all of the curricula. We don't want to just see a situation where, okay, we're going to read books written by white male Christian authors until February. And then in February, we'll bring out a book written by an African American. And then February passes and we go back to, you know, what we were doing before. We don't want to see that situation. That's not helping prepare our children to succeed in the global workplace. What we want to make sure is that we're assessing whether school districts are doing this successfully, and if they're not, because we do realize that a lot of education schools just aren't even teaching culturally responsive teaching. And so if that is the case, that they have some room for improvement, then we're there to provide some additional support so that those schools can start to better prepare their students for the global workplace.
Here in DC and beyond, or if you have like a call to action for what people can do now to advance school diversity efforts. And I'll take a little privilege here, moderator privilege, and just say, from my perspective, I think it's elevating knowledge, understanding the historical context. I have the pleasure of working with an organization called The Story of Our Schools that partners with DC Public Schools to help students uncover the history of their schools. They go to the archives, they go to museums, and they uncover their histories, their school's unique history, and then they build permanent exhibits that are there to greet, usually in a very prominent place, usually in the entrance of the school. It's there to greet visitors and future students and community members, and it has been a tremendous way of connecting communities and schools, and also building a sense of pride in the students about their school and its unique history. I mean, one thing I learned at Adams Morgan, I didn't know this, one of the schools that we worked with, the history there. Adams was a white school. Morgan was a black school, and the community members, in an effort to unify the communities, brought the names together and really worked toward desegregation. So you learned something new today. But what would your call to action be? How can we help advance desegregation, realize the promise around the world?
I think the call to action would be to educate yourselves, join with community members who are interested in these issues, be vocal about the fact that you would like to see, you know, segregation be retired. There are a lot of movements that are actually picking up steam around this issue. We're seeing it here, we're seeing it in Montgomery County, Maryland, we're seeing it in New York, we're seeing it elsewhere, where a lot of times it's students themselves who are saying, we would like more integrated schools. We want an education that reflects our neighborhoods and our community. And so I would just encourage all of you to learn as much as you possibly can about this issue, and, you know, be vocal about the fact that this is something you want. And, you know, encourage others to learn about the fact that this isn't just a nice idea. This is, the research shows, what is best for our young people and ultimately what is best for our nation.
To reiterate some of those points, coalition building is very important. So finding those who are like-minded, same goal-minded, to be able to band together your arguments. But you're going to have to insist upon some political courage here. So the legislators need to understand why this is important, and sometimes it doesn't advantage them to speak out on some of these elements, but they're going to have to get the political courage. You're going to have to help them get that courage, and courage comes in numbers many times. So I'll say that. One thing, the last thing that I'll mention, because we haven't touched on it too much, historically we're Brown or pre-Brown, or I should say post-Brown. Once Brown was passed, tens of thousands of African American teachers lost their jobs, as well as administrators. So when we talk about the number of Black teachers that are declining, the declination started at that point. So in addition to that, I would encourage you all to make sure you are, or just even with the school district, of being intentional about diversifying the teaching force. There are some intentional strategies that can be employed to make sure that the workforce within the schools is reflective of the school-age children.
So from a policy perspective, I would say that the city should continue to allow for schools that can draw students citywide, do diversity as part of their mission. I think also having resources available for schools to carry out integration within the school's walls is key. And lastly, I think it would be interesting to monitor diversity as a city and see how we're doing over time. We all know what student demographics are for the whole system, but we don't think about how students are distributed at schools enough.
I would say that we would all need to be more courageous about having conversations around inequities that still exist in our schools, recognizing our own power, whether it's white privilege, to be able to have those conversations with colleagues and to care about every school, every child in every ward, even if your child is enrolled in one of the highest performing schools in the district. Because if we have any of our students are denied access and opportunities, we should all be concerned. So basically starting with acknowledging where the inequities exist, why they still exist, and if we are doing anything ourselves to facilitate those inequities. That would start from our policymakers, elected officials, on down to us, and be willing to challenge those inequities. At this time, I'm going to ask one thing that you can do is to sign that petition out on the table saying to fund our schools. We submitted 1,500 parents' names to 4 council members last week, and it helped to move the needle for the school funding by $7.4 million. We're planning on turning in another 5,000 every week until our schools are fully funded, and I ask for your assistance in doing that.
I will reiterate again, learn the history, know the history, share the history. I do want to note, as far as the history of the Brown v. Board in the Bolling case, that in DC, schools did immediately integrate in 1954, but there was resistance. There were boundaries that were redrawn, and many of the schools west of the park remained white through the 60s into the early 70s. Also, the population shift. The white population in the public school system by 1964 was 12.5%. So I'll also say we must be committed to diversity. We have in our archives, you can see the changing demographics from class photos from year to year to a mixed school to completely African American. And I brought some examples with me that I'll leave out on the table as well. And finally, I'm glad Janel brought up Story of Our Schools project. We work very closely with Jen Harris, the founder, and 3rd and 4th grade students are not afraid to talk about these issues. Sometimes I'm a little tentative, and they'll point to a map that's in the archive and say, there are more white schools here than Black schools, and they know all about it, and they're not afraid, and they want to see diversity. So I think we're heading in the right direction with the young folks coming up behind us.
Thank you all, and join me again, a final thank you to